Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. If you're new here, this channel is built on one simple premise, that the most useful lessons are usually the ones somebody else paid for. We find the people who came to this country looking for something, a fresh start, a second chance, a way out of a life that had stopped fitting, and we let them tell you exactly what happened. Not to embarrass them, not to point fingers at Vietnam or the people in it, but because the truth, told honestly by someone who lived it, is worth more than any warning you'll ever read on a forum. Today's story comes from a man named Declan. He's 54. He's from County Roscommon in the west of Ireland, and he spent 30 years as a professional chef before Vietnam found him. Or, more accurately, before he found Vietnam, which is an important distinction that will make more sense as we go. What I can tell you is this. Declan came here with a clear head and open eyes. He knew the stories. He'd heard the warnings. He was not, by any measure, a naive man. And what happened to him happened anyway, not in spite of his awareness, but in some ways because of it. Because he looked at his specific situation and made a specific decision, and that decision had consequences that are still unfolding. The title of this one will raise some eyebrows. It should. But I'd ask you to stay with it, because this story is considerably more complicated than the title suggests, and considerably more honest than most people would be willing to be. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I've been trying to work out where to start this, and I keep coming back to the same place, which is the kitchen. Not Vietnam, not Roscommon, the kitchen. Because if you want to understand any of the decisions I made in the 18 months after I left Ireland, you have to understand what 30 years behind a professional past does to a person, and most people haven't got a clue. Here's what it does. It makes you very good at one thing and moderately useless at everything else. I could feed 200 people a hot meal simultaneously. I could run a brigade of 7 through a Saturday night service without raising my voice. I could look at a piece of fish and tell you within 30 seconds whether it was fresh enough to serve, which sounds impressive until you realize I couldn't tell you what my wife was feeling if she handed me a written summary. Which, in the end, is roughly what it came to. The hours are the thing people don't understand. You're not absent the way an office worker is absent, gone from 9 to 5, home for dinner. You're gone for the dinners. You're gone for the Christmases, or half of them. You're behind a hot stove on a Saturday night, while the rest of the world is out having the Saturday night. After a while, the kitchen becomes more real to you than everything outside it, and everything outside it becomes a slightly theoretical place where your family lives and your life technically happens. I'm not looking for sympathy on that. I knew what the job was when I took it. I'm just explaining the architecture of how things went wrong, which started well before Vietnam. Saban left in October of 2020. I came home from a double shift. We were doing a function, 60th birthday, 70 guests, and the house had that quality of emptiness that isn't just absence. It was the absence of accumulation. 22 years of a person, the way they move through a space, the things they leave on surfaces, the sound of them in another room, all of that, gone. She hadn't taken everything. She'd taken herself, which turned out to be everything that mattered. I found out about Gary later. Gary ran a garden center outside Athlone. Gary had weekends. Gary, I can only assume, smelled of something other than commercial kitchen grease when he came through the door. I hold no particular grudge against Gary. Gary was just the evidence of a problem that had been accumulating for longer than I wanted to admit. The house went to her in the settlement. 22 years of mortgage payments. The garden I'd laid myself. The kitchen I'd renovated with my own hands during the one long stretch I'd had off all of it. Siobhan's. The solicitors were very professional about the whole thing. I moved into a 2-bedroom in Roscommon town in January of 2021 and told everyone I was grand. The flat smelled of the person who'd lived there before me. I never worked out who it had been. Some combination of cigarettes and a particular brand of fabric softener, and something else I couldn't identify that was simply the smell of someone else's life. You'd think that would bother you, moving into a space that smells of a stranger. What I found was that I just got used to it. I stopped noticing after a few weeks, which, looking back, is probably not a great sign about my state of mind at the time. I have a daughter, Aoife. She's in Dublin. She's doing well. She's got her own life. We talk. She's fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. We're both very good at being fine at each other over the phone. The redundancy came in March of 2022. The hotel group had been restructuring since COVID had its way with the hospitality sector, and the restructuring eventually reached the conclusion that a head chef on a senior salary was a cost that could be optimized away. I got a letter, a handshake, and a card. The card had been signed by everyone in the building. I recognized maybe 4 of the names on it, which tells you something about 14 years in a kitchen you can spend over a decade making food for a building full of people and be largely invisible to most of them. I was left with $52,000. The redundancy payout, plus what was left after the solicitors had finished with me, plus a small amount I'd managed to save over the years by working too much to spend anything. €52,000 in a flat that smelled of someone else and absolutely nowhere to be. That's a particular kind of freedom, the kind that looks like options and feels like falling. The Vietnam idea came from Facebook, which is either a banal origin story or an appropriate one depending on your perspective. There's a group expats and retirees in Southeast Asia, and a fella I vaguely knew from Galway, Packy, had been posting from Vietnam for about 6 months. Pictures of him on a plastic stool eating pho, grinning like a man who'd had a very long sentence commuted. He wrote something, once I must have read it 20 times, about how Vietnam was like Ireland in the 80s, but you can feel your hands. I knew what he meant immediately. That warmth, that pre-everything quality. The sense of a place that hasn't been fully processed yet by the machinery of modern life. I didn't want Thailand. Thailand felt like the destination for men having worse crises than mine, and I had enough self-awareness to know that whatever I was doing, I wasn't that. I didn't want Spain. Spain was full of people I might know. And the last thing I needed was to run into someone from Roscommon in a bar in Malaga and have to explain myself. I wanted somewhere foreign enough to feel like a genuine departure, somewhere warm enough to be physically different from everything I was leaving, and somewhere cheap enough that 52,000 might feel like something rather than nothing. I had money, I had time, and I had absolutely nothing keeping me where I was. That's either freedom or a warning, depending on how you look at it. I booked the flight on a Tuesday afternoon in February. 1 bag, window seat. I watched Ireland disappear under cloud cover somewhere over the Irish Sea, and I thought, right then, let's see what this is. I had no idea what was coming. I want to be clear about that, not as an excuse, but as a fact. I was a man who thought he was starting over, and in a way, I was right, just not in the way I meant. Da Nang Airport at 7:30 in the morning in March is not a gentle introduction to anything. I came through the arrivals doors, and the heat just took me by the collar. Not the slow, warm creep you get stepping off a plane in Spain. This was immediate and total, like opening an oven door and putting your face inside it. Except the oven smells of exhaust fumes, and something frying, and the particular sweetness that I later learned was sugarcane juice from a cart about 30 meters to my left. I stood on the pavement with my 1 bag and approximately 30 motorbike taxi drivers looking at me with professional interest. And I thought, right, this is genuinely somewhere else. I'd booked 2 weeks in a serviced apartment through one of the expat groups, a place in the Sun Trod district, which someone had described as quiet enough to sleep, but close enough to the main drag to feel like you're in an actual city. They were right on both counts. It was a small building, 4 floors, run by a Vietnamese family who lived on the ground floor and left you largely alone, which after 14 years of hotel management breathing down my neck felt like a form of luxury I hadn't known I needed. The apartment itself was clean, simply furnished, with a balcony that looked directly onto a side street, not a view, just street. A woman selling banh mi from a cart. A man who appeared every morning at the same time to water 4 pot plants on the opposite pavement, with the concentrated seriousness of someone performing a sacred ritual. I sat on that balcony most mornings, with a café Vietnamese iced coffee, which is served in a small glass with a layer of condensed milk at the bottom, and which I want to state, for the record, is one of the genuinely perfect things humanity has produced. And I watched the street do its business. Motorbikes, school uniforms, old women with conical hats moving through traffic with a calm that suggested they had decided long ago that physics was someone else's problem. I had no obligations, nowhere to be until I decided to be there. I can't fully explain what that felt like after the previous 2 years, except to say that the silence of it, not the quiet, because Da Nang is never quiet, but the internal silence, the absence of dread, was something I hadn't felt in long enough that I'd forgotten. It was a feeling you could have. I walked. Every day, I walked. A professional chef in a new city is essentially a man with a very specific agenda. Find the markets, find where the locals eat, work out the logic of the cuisine. I went to the Shahan market and spent 2 hours moving through stalls with the focused attention of someone conducting research, because I was. I watched a woman make bun bu hu at 5 in the morning with a speed and economy of movement that I found genuinely moving. I ate broken rice with grilled pork and a fried egg from a place with 4 plastic tables on the pavement, and spent the next hour trying to reverse engineer the marinade in my head. I started picking up words. Non gon, delicious. Sakambon, en, thank you. Baoen hie, how much? The basic vocabulary of a man who eats first and asks questions later. I was not in bars. I want to be clear about that because I know what people imagine when they picture a 54-year-old Irish divorcee in Southeast Asia with a lump sum. I was in markets. I was in small restaurants that had no English on the menu and required a degree of pointing and optimistic ordering. I was on my balcony drinking coffee and reading, which I hadn't properly done in years. Whatever I was doing, it looked, from the outside, almost like a man getting himself together. It might even have been that for a while. About 3 weeks in, I took a day trip to Hainan Teen, 45 minutes south of Da Nang by grab car, the old town, a UNESCO site full of yellow buildings and paper lanterns and tourists in Ao Dai they've hired for photographs. I was prepared not to like it. Too managed, too arranged, the kind of place that knows it's picturesque and charges accordingly. I liked it anyway. There's something underneath the tourism in Huiyan that the tourism hasn't quite reached yet. Some quality of actual life still going on in the side streets, and I found myself wandering away from the main drag into quieter lanes where children were doing homework on doorsteps and someone's grandma was gutting fish outside a house that had a small altar burning incense by the door. The cooking class was not my idea, and then it was. I passed a sign, one of about 40, in that part of town advertising a traditional Vietnamese cooking class, and my first instinct was the professional instinct, which was mild contempt. Tourist cooking classes exist to flatter tourists. They are not serious enterprises. The menu would be spring rolls and possibly a curry, and the whole thing would be gently patronizing in the way all educational tourism is gently patronizing. I signed up anyway. I think I was curious what they'd do with it. I think I was also just a 54-year-old man in a foreign country with an afternoon to fill. There were 6 of us. A French couple who had clearly done this kind of thing before and had the matching aprons to prove it. 2 young American women who were doing all of Southeast Asia in 3 weeks and seemed simultaneously exhausted and incandescent with enthusiasm. A German man of about my age who said nothing and did everything with great precision. And me. The class was run by a man named Tuan, who was warm and theatrical and very good at making tourists feel capable. I spent the first 15 minutes being professionally unimpressed in the way that, looking back, must have been quite obvious. And then one of the assistants, a woman who'd been moving quietly around the class, helping people with prep, straightening things, stopped beside me. She looked at my knife grip. She looked at me. She said, in English that was careful and slightly amused, "You have held a knife before, I think." It was not a dramatic line. It was just a true observation, and something about the dryness of it, the lack of performance in it, made me laugh. An actual laugh, not the social laugh I'd been deploying for 2 years whenever someone asked how I was getting on. Her name was Lynn. She was in her early 30s, with quick eyes and a kind of contained energy, the sort of person who notices everything without making a production of noticing. She asked what I did. I told her. She found this genuinely interesting rather than simply something to respond to, which in my experience is rarer than it sounds. She asked what it was like to feed that many people at once, whether it ever felt like a performance or more like manufacturing, whether I thought the food tasted different when you'd made it under that kind of pressure. These were not the questions tourists ask. By the end of the class, I had made a slightly lopsided band zero and eaten it standing at the prep counter with Lynn, who told me what I'd done wrong with the batter and was right about all of it. When people were packing up to leave, she tore a small corner off my recipe sheet, the printed card they'd given us at the start, and wrote her number on it. She didn't ask if I wanted it. She just did it, folded it, and pressed it into my hand, and then went back to clearing the prep station. I still have that piece of paper. It's in my wallet. I know exactly where it is. Whether that's romantic or pathetic, I've genuinely stopped trying to decide. I got the grab back to Da Nang as the sun was dropping behind the hills and the lanterns along the Thu Bien River were starting to come on. I sat on my balcony that evening without the coffee, just sitting, and I felt something I hadn't felt in long enough that it took me a moment to identify it. Hope. Just a small amount. The cautious, provisional kind that a sensible man treats carefully. I sat with it for a while. Then I spent 20 minutes talking myself out of it, going through all the reasons it was probably nothing, probably a misread, probably a woman being professionally friendly to a tourist in a tourist kitchen. Then I thought, I'm 54 years old. I came to the other side of the world to feel something. And here's a feeling. I texted her the next morning. She replied in 4 minutes. I want to be careful how I tell this part. Not careful in the sense of protecting myself from judgment. I've well passed that point, as anyone who's made it this far can tell. Careful in the sense that I've thought about this particular stretch of time more than any other, turned it over from more angles than I can count, and I still can't tell you with certainty where the reel ended and the performance began. I'm not sure those two things were as separable as I'd like them to be. What I can tell you is what I observed. And what I observed in those first weeks with Lynn did not look like what I'd been warned about. She texted back the morning after the cooking class, suggesting we get bomba huang, not at a restaurant aimed at tourists, at a place near the Chuchin market where the tables were small plastic things, and the broth had been going since before sunrise, and there was no menu because there was only one thing, and you either wanted it or you didn't. I wanted it. We sat across from each other at 9:30 in the morning in 32-degree heat eating beef noodle soup that was spiced with lemongrass and shrimp paste, and something else I couldn't isolate, but spent a happy 20 minutes trying to. And she watched me eat with the amused patience of someone watching a person encounter something obvious for the first time. That was the thing about her. She watched. She was attentive in a way that I, having spent 3 decades in professional kitchens and 2 years prior to that in a marriage that had slowly run out of attention, found genuinely disorienting. She asked questions and then listened to the answers. She wanted to know about the hotel kitchen, not the romantic idea of it, the reality of it, the physical brutality and the noise, and what happens to your knees and your lower back after 30 years on hard floors. She asked whether I'd ever wanted to do anything else. Nobody had asked me that in years. I'm not sure anyone had ever asked me that. When the bill came, she reached for it. I got there first. She didn't perform reluctance. She just said fine and let me pay without making anything of it in either direction. And I thought, noted, because the version of this story I'd been warned about does not involve the woman reaching for the bill. It involves the woman never appearing to notice the bill exists. I am aware of how this sounds. I am aware that I'm building a case for why I was right to trust her. And I'm building it using evidence I've since had reason to doubt. I know that. But I want you to understand that the case was built on real observations, not wishful thinking, at least at the start. The wishful thinking came later, when the observations started getting more complicated, and I needed them to still add up to the same answer. We began spending real time together through April. Day trips down the coast, evenings at food stalls along the Han River, where you could eat a full meal for about 70,000 dong, roughly €3, and sit outside with a bia hia, the draft beer they serve in these small glasses that seem designed to encourage you to order another immediately, which they are. She showed me parts of Da Nang that weren't in any guidebook because they weren't interesting to anyone who wasn't actually living there. The wholesale fish market before dawn, where the catch came in from the sea and the noise was extraordinary. A banh mi cart run by an elderly man whose sandwiches were, and I say this as a professional, genuinely some of the best things I have eaten in my life. A coffee shop on a residential street, where the owner grew his own beans on a small plot outside the city and roasted them himself, and talked about flavor profiles with the intensity of a man who had found his purpose. I cooked for her in my apartment twice in April. The second time she stayed, and I want to be honest about that, because it's part of the story, and because the easy version of this story treats that as the obvious mechanism of entrapment, and I don't think it was that simple. It wasn't that simple from my side. I don't know what it was from hers. By the end of April, I had spent probably 250, maybe €300 on meals, on a taxi she'd needed late one evening, on a dress I'd seen her looking at in a market stall in Hainan on a Saturday afternoon. I'd like to be very clear about something. I categorize that as normal relationship spending. A man and a woman spending time together. The man paying more often than not because he had more money, and because that's what you do. I was not keeping a ledger. I was not aware of the running total because there was no running total. There was just a relationship and the normal costs of relationship, and I was happy in a way that surprised me every morning when I woke up to it. I hadn't thought about the garden center fella in 3 weeks. That might sound like nothing. It was not nothing. The mother conversation happened in the second week of May. We were at her favorite coffee shop Small place, 2 tables, off a back alley in the Huishai Chu district. The owner, a woman named Bahua, who always brought Lin's order without being asked. Lin had been quieter than usual, and I'd noticed but hadn't pushed, because in my experience pushing tends to close things rather than open them. Eventually, she told me. Her mother, in the village south of the city, had been unwell. She'd been to the hospital 3 times in the past month. There were tests, there were medications, and there was a bill that her family was struggling to cover. Lin said this carefully, with her eyes on her coffee, and she was very specific about one thing. She wasn't asking. She just wanted me to know what was going on. She said she was sorry to bring it to me. Now, I want to stop here for a moment and be very direct with you. I knew about this, not about her mother specifically, but about this particular shape of conversation. The sick relative, the medical costs, the careful emphasis on not asking. It is, if you spend 5 minutes on any expat forum in Southeast Asia, described as the single most common opening move in exactly the kind of relationship I was supposedly smart enough not to be in. I had read about it multiple times. I was not ignorant of the pattern. I gave her the money anyway. 32 million dong, which at the time was approximately x 1400. I gave it because I wasn't an idiot who didn't know the score. I knew the score. I just thought the score didn't apply here. I had spent 6 weeks watching this specific woman, and the person I'd watched for 6 weeks was not the person those forum posts described. She reached for bills. She took me to cheap places. She asked questions about my knees. And now she was sitting across from me, not asking for help with her mother's medical costs, in a way that was either genuine restraint or a very precise piece of theater, and I had to make a decision about which one it was. I made my decision. She cried when I transferred the money. Not dramatically, she turned her face slightly away and was quiet for a moment, and then she said she would pay me back. I told her it didn't matter. She said it mattered to her. I said I knew, and that it still didn't matter to me. She reached across the small table and put her hand on my forearm for a moment, and then she picked up her coffee. I still don't know whether that moment was real. I've sat with that question for a long time now. What I've landed on is this. I'm not sure it matters whether it was real or not, because the function it served, the permission it gave me to keep believing what I wanted to believe, was identical either way. She mentioned the village 2 weeks later. Her family wanted to meet me, she said. She would like that, if I was willing. And I thought, you don't introduce a man to your family unless this is something. You don't do that for 1400. Which was, I can see now, exactly the right thing to think, at exactly the right moment. But I didn't know that yet. I just thought I was a man who was lucky enough to be wanted somewhere. I want to tell you about the preparation for this trip, because people skip over that part, and it matters. The week before we drove down to the village, Lynn sat across from me at the kitchen table in my apartment, with the focused expression she used when something was important to her, and she briefed me. That's the only word for it. She told me what fruit to bring. Dragon fruit, specifically, 2 large ones, because her mother liked them, and because arriving with food was respectful. She told me there was a particular kind of banhano zan, a mung bean sweet, that I should pick up from a specific shop in the He Shatu market. Not any shop. That shop, because quality mattered in this context. She told me how to greet her mother both hands, slight bow, wait for her to speak first. She told me not to refuse food under any circumstances, which I told her would not be a problem. I found this briefing charming beyond all reasonable measure. It meant she was taking it seriously. It meant there were standards to meet, protocols that existed because the occasion had weight. You don't brief a man on fruit selection for an introduction that doesn't matter. We drove down on a Saturday in late May, in a hired car, heading south and then inland, away from the coast. The landscape changed in a way I found professionally interesting. The tourist infrastructure of Da Nang and Hien fell away, and the actual countryside appeared. And the actual countryside of rural central Vietnam is lush and agricultural and slightly overwhelming if you're coming from Roscommon. The roadside food stalls changed character the further inland we went. Less tourist-oriented bun chua, more simple rice dishes in metal pots, more grilled things I couldn't identify but could smell from 30 meters and wanted immediately. I kept noting things out the window, with the specific attention of a man who has spent 30 years thinking about where food comes from, and Lynn watched me doing it and seemed, I think, genuinely pleased that I was paying that kind of attention. The village was about 3 hours south. The family home was a single-story house set back from the road behind a concrete courtyard, surrounded by a garden with banana trees and a vegetable plot that someone had been tending with great care. As we pulled up, I noticed there were already 3 or 4 women standing in the doorway, and a cluster of children who had apparently been waiting and now broke from the doorway like a small, joyful flood. I am a large man. I am 6'1" and broadly built from 30 years of carrying things in professional kitchens, and I am the particular shade of Irish red that suggests I have never successfully tanned and never will. Within approximately 40 seconds of getting out of the car, I had 4 children attached to various parts of me, all of them finding my height and complexion an inexhaustible source of amusement. The aunties arrived. There were, at a conservative estimate, 5 aunties. Each one greeted me with warmth that felt, and I recognize I may be the wrong person to assess this, completely genuine. I was photographed with the children, with the aunties, with a small dog that appeared from somewhere, and with a rooster who did not seem to have consented to the arrangement but was overruled. I was fed constantly. This is not an exaggeration. From the moment I sat down in the main room of the house, there was food appearing at regular intervals. A rice paper roll with fresh herbs and pork that was among the best I have ever eaten. A clear soup with a flavor I couldn't fully place, but suspected involved dried shrimp and something fermente. A plate of sliced green mango with a dipping salt that was sharp and addictive, and went perfectly with the beer that had also appeared, cold, from somewhere. I ate everything. I refused nothing. Lynn translated my enthusiasm for the food, and the aunties looked at me with the approval of women who have always understood that eating well is a form of respect. And then the mother. She was smaller than I expected, and frailer. The woman I'd imagined from Lynn's description of the hospital visits, worried, diminished by illness, matched what I saw. She was sitting in a chair in the main room, and she did not get up when we came in, and Lynn went to her first and spoke quietly, and then she beckoned me over. I crouched down in front of her so we were at eye level, because it seemed wrong to loom. I put my hands forward the way Lynn had shown me. The mother took both of my hands in hers. Her hands were very small, very dry, the hands of a woman who has worked outdoors for most of her life, and she looked at my face for what felt like a long time. Then she spoke. Slowly, in Vietnamese. Lynn, standing just behind me, translated. She said, "He has an honest face. I am going to be as accurate as I can about what happened to me in that moment, because it matters to the story, and because I owe you the honesty of it. I am a man who spent 30 years invisible. 30 years in the back of a building making things for people who never thought about the person who made them. A man whose wife left while he was working a double shift. A man who moved into a flat that smelled of someone else and told everyone he was grand. And an elderly Vietnamese woman, who had no reason to flatter me and nothing obvious to gain from kindness, looked at my face and found something true about it. I believed her completely. Not because I am naive, because I needed it to be true, and because she said it as a fact rather than a compliment. And those two things together were more than I knew how to resist. That evening, after the children were in bed, after the plates had been cleared and a bottle of Reserve Nupi Vietnamese rice wine, clear and warm and considerably more potent than it looked had been opened, the uncle appeared. He was a different kind of presence to the aunties, quieter, more deliberate, a man who chose when to enter a room. He sat down across from me and Lynn shifted her posture slightly, and I registered this shift but did not assign any meaning to it at the time. Through Lynn, the uncle explained the situation. Her brother Min had an opportunity. A motorbike repair business on the edge of the town had come available. The owner was retiring, the client base was established. It was the kind of steady small business that a young man with some capital could make something of. The difficulty was that Min didn't have the capital. The figure the uncle mentioned was 196 million dong. At the time, approximately 8,500. The uncle was not charming about this. He was not apologetic. He presented it the way a man presents a reasonable business proposition, which in fairness it may have been. He gave me no particular reason to say yes. He just laid out the facts and let them sit. I said I'd think about it. Looking back at that moment, I think the thing that made it feel legitimate was precisely that he didn't press. He nodded, said something that Lynn translated as, of course, "Take your time," and then the conversation moved on, and more rice wine was poured, and someone put on a Vietnamese pop song from a small speaker on the windowsill that the children had left behind. I gave them 6,000 euro the following Tuesday. I want to be clear about why it wasn't the full 8,500. I told myself it was negotiation. I told myself I was being prudent, holding something back, demonstrating that I wasn't simply a man who handed over whatever was asked. What I actually negotiated was the precise amount required to feel in control of something I was not in control of. Paying slightly less made me feel shrewd. I was not shrewd. I was a man who had decided to invest in a story he needed to believe, and the price of the story was €6,000, and he paid it. Lynn's hands, I should note, stayed entirely clean in this transaction. The ask had come from the uncle. The money went to the uncle. Lynn had translated, apologetically, the way a person translates something they didn't choose to be in the middle of. I noted this as further evidence of her integrity. I note it now as evidence of something else. The drive back to Da Nang the following Sunday was different from the drive down. Something had settled. The relationship felt more solid, the way a structure feels more solid once it has been tested. I had met the family. I had eaten the food. I had been told I had an honest face. I had invested in something real and tangible. I rang Wi-Fi from the car window as we came back through the coastal road, the South China Sea, blue and flat to the left of us. The sky, the particular clear white of a hot day cooling into evening. She asked how I was. I told her I was good. Better than good, actually. She asked what I'd been up to, and I said I'd been down to visit a friend's family in the countryside. There was a small pause. She said that sounded nice. It did sound nice. It was nice. I didn't tell her how much it had cost, which was the omission I still think about most. I could afford it, I told myself. And if it was real, it was the right thing to do. And if it wasn't real, well, I wasn't ready to live in that version of events yet. I was not ready for quite a while longer. By August, I had stopped counting days. I'm not sure exactly when it happened. Sometime in July, I think, I realized. I'd lost track of how long I'd been in Vietnam and felt no particular need to work it out. That's a different relationship with time than I'd had in 30 years of shift rotas and service schedules and knowing exactly how many days until the next function booking. In the hotel kitchen, I always knew what day it was. In Da Nang in August, I sometimes had to check my phone. I had Vietnamese words now. Not many, and not arranged into anything resembling conversation, but enough for the transactions of daily life: Singam Sin, Chin Lai, Cho Toi, and the numbers up to 100, which gets you further than you'd think. I knew the woman at the banya cart near my building by sight, and she knew my order. I knew which table at the coffee shop 2 streets over had the best fan angle. I knew where to park a motorbike outside the Chichon market, which I'd rented for the month for about €40, because, after 5 months in Vietnam, you either learn to ride or you spend your life in grab cars and taxis. I had a routine. This is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about that period. After the Roscommon flat and the redundancy and the general dissolution of the previous 2 years, I had an actual routine: coffee, market or walk, a few hours reading or exploring, evenings with Lynn, cooking together 2 or 3 times a week. The life was simple, and it was mine, and it was, from the inside, entirely indistinguishable from something real. The apartment situation came up in late July. Lynn mentioned it carefully, the way she mentioned most things that required careful mention almost in passing, without apparent urgency, as if she was thinking aloud rather than making a request. Her living arrangement with her friend had become complicated. The friend's family circumstances had changed. The logistics were difficult. She didn't elaborate much, and I didn't press, because pressing had never been my instinct with her, and because I was, by this point, invested enough that I was more interested in solving the problem than interrogating its details. My apartment had always been my place. That's the thing I should say. From the beginning, from the first month, it was the apartment I'd rented before I knew her, and even after she'd started spending nights there regularly, it retained that quality of being mine. My things, my habits, my balcony with my coffee, and my pot plant watering neighbor across the street. There was something about that, the separateness of it, the fact that she always arrived and always left, that had begun to feel, in a way I couldn't quite articulate, like a statement about the relationship I didn't want to be making. Like a ceiling I'd installed without meaning to. I want to be careful here about who suggested what, because I've been over this many times and I'm still not entirely sure. What I can say is that the idea of finding a place together felt like mine as much as hers. That matters to me. Not as an excuse. I'm past excuses, but as a fact about how it happened. I was not talked into it. I walked toward it. The distinction may be meaningless to you. It isn't to me. We found an apartment in the Ng Han Sign district. Nicer area than where I'd been, closer to the beach, with a proper kitchen. A real kitchen gas hob, decent counter space, a set of pans that were actually heavy enough to be useful. I stood in it the day we viewed it and ran my hand along the counter, the way a chef does when assessing workspace, out of pure habit, and Lynn watched me do this and smiled in a way that felt like she understood what the gesture meant. She probably did. 6 months up front. 74 million dong, approximately 3,200. The lease went in her name. I want to explain how this worked, because I've told this part to people since, and watched them look at me with an expression I recognize as the expression of someone who thinks they would have noticed something I didn't notice. The explanation is this. As a foreign national in Vietnam without my long-term residency paperwork properly arranged, putting my name on a lease was genuinely complicated. Landlords prefer local lessees. The paperwork involved is real. This is not a fiction I constructed after the fact. It was the actual administrative reality of my situation, and it was mentioned by the letting agent, not by Lin, and it was the standard arrangement for expats renting in this way. Howard, when I met him later, noted it as something else entirely. But I didn't know Howard yet. I just knew it was easier this way, and easier felt fine. The first weeks in the new apartment were good. I'm going to say that plainly and not qualify it into nothing. They were good. I cooked. She was there. I made bibu one evening, a Vietnamese beef stew with star anise and lemongrass that I'd been working out how to make properly for 2 months. And she sat on the kitchen counter and watched me adjust the seasoning and told me what was wrong with it, and was right about 2 of the 3 things. We ate it with a baguette from the bakery down the street because there is still, in Vietnam, a legacy of French bread infrastructure that I find deeply moving. It was an ordinary evening. It was not ordinary to me. I called this period the good bit, and then caught myself on the past tense of it, and then moved on. The running total, which I was not keeping, stood at just under 19,000 by this point, hospital money. Family business investment. Apartment. 6 months of meals and transport, and the occasional market gift. I wasn't tracking it. I was living in it, which is a different thing, and one I'd recommend you think carefully about before judging too quickly. The first piece of grit appeared in September. I want to be accurate about how small it was, because the temptation when telling a story like this is to make each warning sign dramatic, in retrospect, to give it the weight it deserved rather than the weight it had at the time. This had almost no weight at the time. I was curious about the motorbike business, not anxious, just genuinely interested in how Min was getting on with it, whether the transition of ownership had been straightforward, whether he'd needed to hire anyone. I asked Lynn. She said he was very busy, still settling in. He'd call when there was news to share. In Ireland, I'd have had a text within a week, some update, some acknowledgement that the money had been received and was being put to use. Not a financial report, just basic human communication, the kind you'd send a friend who'd done you a favor. There was nothing like that. When I mentioned this to Lynn, she gave me the explanation, and I gave myself the context. And the context was, this isn't Ireland. Family financial matters are handled differently here. You don't chase people up on money, it's considered crass, it implies distrust. I filed this under cultural differences and moved on. I filed quite a lot of things under cultural differences in September. Looking back, the filing cabinet was getting full. October arrived, and with it, the rhythm of the season shifting slightly less heat, a different quality of light in the late afternoon, the tourists that clogged Hoi An and starting to thin. I'd come to love October in Da Nang. The city felt more like itself. Lynn mentioned the second village visit one morning over coffee on the balcony, her mother's birthday. The family would like to celebrate together. She thought I should come. I said yes without pausing to think about it, entirely without hesitation. A data point, I have since noted. I was a man who had a routine and an apartment, and a woman who wanted him to come to her mother's birthday. I had no reason in the world to say anything other than yes. I said yes. The second visit started the same way as the first. The same children breaking from the doorway when the car pulled up. The same aunties appearing from different parts of the house with the coordinated efficiency of women who had been waiting and were pleased their waiting was over. The same concrete courtyard, the same banana trees, the same vegetable plot. Someone had strung paper lanterns along the front of the house for the birthday red and gold, swaying slightly in the afternoon air. And there were chairs set outside and a table with a cloth on it that suggested a party rather than just a meal. The mother's birthday. Neighbors would come. There would be more people than the first visit, more noise, more rice wine. I was a known quantity this time, which felt different from being welcomed. The first visit I'd been a novelty, the tall red Irishman that Lynn had brought home, a curiosity, something to be assessed. This time the children ran to me specifically, by name, and the aunties greeted me with the ease of people greeting someone who has already passed the relevant tests. One of them made a joke in Vietnamese that made the others laugh, and Lynn translated it as, she says, "You've gotten more color," which, at that point, I had, and which, in an Irish context, means something quite different, but here seemed to mean he's been here long enough to know the son. It felt like acceptance. I want to say that clearly, because it's relevant to what happened next. The cousin Mai was introduced sometime in the early evening, during a loose pre-dinner hour when neighbors had started arriving, and the space between the house and the courtyard was filling with people. She was younger than Lynn, late 20s, I'd say, and she had a different quality to her. Where Lynn had always been composed, calibrated, with a warmth that now, in retrospect, I recognize as something she administered rather than something she simply had, Mai was just present, direct. She looked at you straight on and waited to see what you'd do with that, which is a different kind of attention entirely. She spoke very little English. We communicated through gesture and expression, and the 5 or 6 words of Vietnamese I had that were useful in a social context, plus her 5 or 6 words of English, which were better than she let on, I suspect. It was the kind of conversation that doesn't need much language, because it isn't really about information. In hindsight, Lynn was always performing something. Mai wasn't performing anything. Which one of those is more dangerous? I still haven't worked out. Lynn left at about 9 o'clock. I want to be very precise about how this happened, because I have assembled it many times since, and I still can't find the seam. She got a call. She stepped away from the table, spoke briefly, came back with an apologetic expression. Something at work, a problem that needed her attention tonight, not tomorrow. She was sorry. She'd get a lift back to Da Nang with a cousin who was leaving now anyway. There was absolutely no reason for me to leave, too. I should stay, enjoy the birthday. The bus back in the morning was simple, and she'd send me the details. The explanation was smooth. The departure was smooth. She kissed me on the cheek, said goodnight to her mother, said something to the aunties in Vietnamese that produced nodding and smiling, and then she was in a car and the car was gone. I didn't think anything of it. I had rice wine, I had the lanterns, I had a family that had just told me I'd gotten more color. I stayed. I'm not going to tell you the details of what happened that night. I've told this story a number of times now, and that part is always the same. I say there was rice wine, there was conversation that needed almost no shared language, and there was a mistake. I use that word, a mistake. I say it once, and I don't revisit it because revisiting it serves no purpose for either of us. What I will tell you is the Sunday morning. The bus back to Da Nang, which left from the main road at 7:30 and took 2 hours on a route that wound through the same countryside I'd watched with professional interest a few months earlier, except that I was not watching it with professional interest now. I was sitting in a window seat on a crowded local bus, feeling the specific physical discomfort of too much rice wine, and the specific psychological discomfort of a man who knows he has done something genuinely wrong and is trying to work out how wrong and whether it matters and whether anyone will ver know. I told myself 2 things on that bus: that it meant nothing, and that Lynn would never know. The village, it turns out, has its own communications infrastructure that operates entirely without Wi-Fi. Within a week of coming back, her messages shortened, not stop-shortened. Single sentences where there had been paragraphs. Hours between replies where there had been minutes. When I asked what was wrong, she said nothing, and I recognized the register of that nothing immediately. It was the same frequency as Shaban's nothing. The particular toneless precision of a woman who knows everything and has elected to let you live in the uncertainty of whether she knows. I asked twice. The second time, she said she was just tired. I believed this for approximately 2 days. The translator was a practical decision. A university student named Fuck, who advertised on the expat Facebook group as available for translation and business interpretation, excellent English, good rates. I hired him to help me compose a message to Lynn that explained, or attempted to explain, what had happened and what it had meant, which was complicated, because I wasn't entirely sure what it had meant. Fook read my draft, asked a few questions about the situation with the directness of a 20-year-old who hasn't yet learned to be tactful about things that don't affect him personally, and then told me, gently, but without much ceremony, that before I sent anything I should probably have a conversa. Tian with some of the longer-term expats in the city first. He connected me with Howard. Howard was British. Retired civil servant, 6 years in Da Nang, with the particular demeanor of a man who has been through his own version of this and come out the other side with a great deal of compassion and absolutely no remaining capacity for surprise. He met me at a cafe near the Han River on a Tuesday morning, bought the coffees without making anything of it, and listened to the full story from the beginning. Then he talked. He never used the word scam. I want to be clear about that because I think it mattered to how I received what he said. He just described what had happened, item by item. in the neutral tone of a man describing a process he has observed before. The hospital money, the most common opening movement, the family visit, the warmth, the establishment of emotional investment before any financial request. The uncle as the delivery mechanism, keeping Lynn's hands clean, making the ask feel like a business matter rather than something personal. The business investment at a figure negotiated slightly down so the investor feels agency. The apartment lease, in the local partner's name, for reasons that were administratively real and practically significant in ways that only became clear later. And the second village visit. He paused before this part. He asked how well I knew the cousin. I told him I hadn't known her before that weekend. He nodded. He asked whether Lynn leaving early had seemed unusual at the time. I said no. He nodded again. He said he couldn't be certain of anything. He said that was important for me to know. He wasn't telling me facts. He was telling me the shape of something he'd seen before, and I could assess it against my own experience of the specifics. But in his observation, over 6 years of knowing expats in this city, the second visit with the early departure and the available cousin was not an accident in the way I'd been hoping it was. I sat with this for a long time. I kept thinking. She held my hand, the mammy. She said I had an honest face. I said this to Howard. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was probably the part worth thinking about most carefully. I wonder now who else she said that to, the days after Howard's coffee. I tried Lynn once more, a message that said I'd like to talk, that I thought something was wrong between us, and I wanted to address it. She replied once, briefly. She'd been very busy, things at work, she'd be in touch. The follow-up I sent 3 days later received no reply. The one after that received no reply. The relationship ended not with a confrontation, but with silence, which is its own kind of answer, and in some ways a worse one, because it leaves everything unresolved and unresolvable. I contacted the building manager about the apartment lease. He was a practical man who explained practical things without apparent emotion. The lease was in her name, the advance payment had been made by me, there was no mechanism under the rental agreement or under applicable local convention by which I could recover it. He said this the way a man says something that is simply true and doesn't require further discussion. I sat in that apartment, her apartment, technically, in every way that mattered, legally for 3 weeks after that conversation. I paid rent on it. I used the kitchen I'd run my hand along and thought was mine. I looked at the counter space and thought about the bagel and the French bread from the bakery down the street. That was it. No scene, no confrontation. She just closed a tab. I didn't go home. I want to say that first because I know it's what people expect. The story ends, the man gets on a plane, goes back to wherever he came from and licks his wounds in familiar surroundings. That's the logical conclusion. Roscommon in December, the flat that smelled of someone else, the cold, the post-mortem conversations with people who would try very hard not to say, I told you so, and wouldn't quite manage it. I couldn't do it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I'm still not sure. What I did instead was nothing. For 3 weeks. I stayed in the Da Nang apartment, her apartment, the one I'd paid for and couldn't recover, and I existed in it with the low-grade misery of a man who can't quite bring himself to leave a place even after every reason to be there has gone. I ate badly. Takeaway containers, convenience store food, the kind of eating that a chef does when he's stopped thinking about food as something that matters. I didn't go to the markets. I didn't go to the coffee shop with the good fan angle. I sat on the balcony of a different apartment in a different district and looked at a different street and thought about Howard's coffee for long stretches of time. The thing about not cooking, for me, is what it signals. I've been in kitchens since I was 22. Cooking is how I think, how I process, how I demonstrate that I'm functional. When I stop cooking, it means something has gone genuinely wrong in a way that the ordinary coping mechanisms can't reach. A musician who stops playing, that's the equivalent. I stopped playing for 3 weeks. In December, I moved out. I did not go to the airport. I went to Hainan. I want to explain this because people find it strange, including Aoi Fei, when I eventually told her some of it. Hainan is where I met Lynn. It should be the last place I'd want to be, saturated with the specific memories of the cooking class and the recipe sheet and all the hopefulness of that first day. But here's the thing. Hainan is also where I felt, for a few hours on a Tuesday afternoon, completely myself, a professional in a tourist kitchen, being teased about a knife grip, laughing an actual laugh for the first time in 2 years. Before the story started. Before I decided anything. The last clean place. I wanted to go back to before the deciding. I found a room in a guest house off one of the residential lanes, run by a family who asked no questions and charged reasonable rates and left a flask of hot water outside the door every morning, which is the kind of quiet thoughtfulness that I find, even now, unexpectedly moving. The first 3 days I walked. The next 3 days I started eating again. Properly, a bowl of cow luwu, the high-end noodle dish made with local water that you supposedly can't replicate anywhere else, at a place I'd been to with Lynn once and had to consciously decide not to think about. Then I started cooking. I'd noticed Marta and Peter's restaurant on several of the Huayan visits over the preceding months. A small place in the old town, good location, nice room, food that was technically competent but had no point of view. The menu was the menu of a restaurant that had been designed around what tourists expected rather than what was actually interesting. And I had the professional observation of it filed away without really knowing why. In January, I walked in during the quiet afternoon hours and asked to speak to the owner. Peter came out from the back, Dutch, late 40s, with the cautious expression of a restaurateur approached by a